perhaps someone who can help us understand it a bit better, because there is a lot that is being said out at the Northwest. And of course, we do have the presenter of On the Spot here on ENCA and political analyst Lukhona Mnguni. Very good morning to you, Lukhona. So much has been said by just the two guests that Puleli Treaty Jones, our reporter, has spoken to. But one of the things that earlier on Dlozima Towane was saying was that there can only but be two outcomes here from this weekend, that this conference actually does not happen. But if it does go ahead, the result is that Supra Mahumapelo will be the chairperson. I mean, is that something that we could possibly see?
Well, good morning to you, Morena and Faith. I can never know who's going to win a conference these days. Sometimes, as you say, they are so tightly contested. I think we have about 5 people at least who have put up their hands in the province of the Northwest to be considered for this position. But of course, some might have met the threshold during the branch nomination process. We will have to see if others their names will be raised on the floor while the nominations are being concluded, and whether or not they will meet the necessary threshold. We saw this in KwaZulu-Natal, where Nomusa Dube-Ncube, was nominated from the floor. She accepted, did not make threshold. And then Sandile Zungu was nominated from the floor and declined nomination. So there is always a sifting process that happens during the confirmation of those nominations at plenary that almost tells you the direction at which a conference might be going. Again, taking lessons from KwaZulu-Natal, when Nomagugu Simelane accepted nomination as deputy chairperson from the floor, the room just erupted in a way that you almost could read that it was guaranteed for her and most likely guaranteed for those who are in the same proverbial slate as her. But it's not always guaranteed, right? In Gauteng, we saw how tightly contested these positions can be and how much of a mixed outcome you can get at times. So we will have to see, give the process an opportunity to go ahead. What we know currently is that there is no interdict on the conference itself going ahead. There is simply an interdict on some votes, which of course are those constituted by the members of the interim provincial committee.
You know, Lukhona, on that note, I want us just to labor on the point of the interim provincial committee, because one such an argument would be if it's the very same committee that was behind even the galvanizing of this conference and behind the organizing of this conference, and they themselves have been barred from voting, where the legitimacy and the constitutionality of the IPC is actually in question. So then does it not mean that all the duties that they've carried out so far have also been in question? If your constitutionality as a body is now questioned, does it not mean that even the decisions that were made under that body are also in question? Or are we then able to almost separate the duties versus, the IPC and the existence in itself?
Absolutely, Faith. The nub is really on that last point you make. To make a different example that is not necessarily political for you, if you remember, when the appointment of Menzi Simelane was reversed by the Constitutional Court, at the time he had been appointed the National Director of Public Prosecutions, the court was very clear it does not invalidate the decisions that he would have made as NDPP, as long as those decisions were to the Constitution, were to the law, and were to any other legal framework that governed the office of the NDPP. Equally here, the IPC's work has not been put to question. The IPC's integrity in office has not been put to question, but they are standing, honestly, and their ability to vote is the fighting point. And I think, Faith, this is something that the ANC itself has not adequately addressed amongst its ranks. If you remember, in eThekwini Regional Conference in KwaZulu-Natal, one of the biggest talking points was that some of the members of the task team that was, looking after that region and taking it to conference were not people who come from eThekwini region, which then meant that it's difficult for you to give voting rights to the task team because you are going to distort outcomes. You're going to have people who come from Moses Mabhida region influencing the outcome in eThekwini region. So I do think that as time goes by, the ANC does have to interrogate its constitution properly insofar as task teams are concerned and the interim provincial committees are concerned. The risk, Faith, lies here. You may have a provincial executive committee elected by people, and then towards the end of its term, the upper structure finds some reason to disband that provincial executive committee and then just show up its own interim structure made up of its preferred people who then can go vote and influence in a particular direction. So you always have to be mindful not to circumvent what were democratic outcomes, internal party democratic outcomes by way of voting in a PEC. And you will remember, Faith, that in fact the disbandment of the PEC in Northwest is something that Supra Mahumapelo took to the Johannesburg South Gauteng High Court, and he won. But they decided to resolve it politically insofar as saying, no, but let's still put an interim provincial committee for the sake of unity, for the sake of politics in the province, and Supra eventually resigned himself from that interim provincial committee. So there's been a bit of history brewing up in the Northwest, but insofar as an interim provincial structure or an interim regional structure is allowed to vote, I think this is something that the ANC really needs to consider and put finality on when it interrogates its constitution and possible constitutional amendments in the December National Conference.
Sure.
Just before we let you go, Lukhona, now that you mentioned the December elective conference, so much has happened with all of these ANC elective conferences, and of course we're seeing it culminate now in what is happening in the Northwest. The question I would imagine that ANC followers, loyalists, members would want to know is, how is this, particularly this conference in the Northwest, and what is happening with it now, going to affect what happens in December?
Well, we need the Northwest to run its affairs adequately, and unlike it did in 2017, if you remember, in the build-up to NASREC 2017, a few delegates, a number of delegates in actual fact, from the Northwest could not vote because certain regions got disqualified to participate in the NASREC conference because of poor administration, what appeared to be manipulation of the processes, what appeared to be lack of due diligence, not following the branch audit guidelines of the ANC, trying to cook the political outcome and so on. So Northwest, I hope they have taken lessons from 2017, and that as they run this provincial conference, and then as they prepare for the nomination of delegates, nomination of leaders by branches and so on in the build-up to December, that they will do it well so that they can have as high a delegation as possible within the branches that would have passed audit. That's the first thing. The second one, it will be interesting really to see who eventually becomes the chairperson of the province, because if the former chairperson who had been booted out by way of protests and all of these things is brought back to be chairperson of the province, it may signal how the ground has relatively shifted, or not necessarily shifted much, in the province of the Northwest, and it would be difficult to then get rid of him again. And he's now at the National Assembly, he's a portfolio chairperson, so he's not playing a role necessarily in governance, but that question will arise as in terms of who has to take over government. But I think insofar as asking the question, where will they put their support going to December National Conference, I think it's a little premature. We'll have to hear them out because so many moving pieces keep developing in our political landscape.
Yeah, so many very interesting moving pieces within the discourse of the African National Congress there. We leave it there for now. Political analyst Lukhona Mnguni joining us this morning just to shed some light in terms of the developments in the Northwest there.